So I know this is a super fun, exciting topic that a lot of home gardeners and farmers are interested in. So let's dive in. And to introduce myself for those who might be new to these meetings, my name is Nick Valesky. I work for our USU Extension Integrated Pest Management Program. So a lot of my background and experience involves commercial vegetable production, plant pathology, entomology, and of course, integrated pest management. So to get started, I wanted to go over these various terms and their definitions. So these are common terms that you guys might have heard of: trap cropping, companion planting, and intercropping. There's a lot of similarities in these definitions, but there's a lot of differences as well. So I think it's important that we learn them and use them appropriately. So the first one, trap cropping. This involves growing plants alongside a target crop that may be more appealing to certain pests, thereby protecting that crop. Companion planting refers to the establishment of two or more species in close proximity so that there's some cultural benefit, such as pest control or increased yield, that can be achieved. And then lastly, intercropping is the growing of two or more crops in close proximity to promote beneficial interactions between them. So really, I kind of see intercropping as the umbrella term that kind of describes a lot of these things that we're going to talk about tonight. So first things first, I think the first concept that I want you guys to grasp in this presentation is: how are insects attracted to a plant to begin with? Well, science has theorized that insects use chemical smells and taste cues to help them recognize host plants. So insects differentiate plants based on the odors and taste. So the chemistry of the plant determines its appeal to an insect. So this is a really important concept that you guys need to think about when we talk about intercropping. So first, we're going to talk about trap cropping. Designing a successful strategy for trap cropping requires a solid understanding of the pest insect, its host plant preferences, the pattern of movement, and the timing of infestation and reproduction. So in these next few slides, I'm going to go over some different examples of trap cropping methods that have been studied in various locations all over the world, and kind of the studies they did and how it's set up and how it works. So here's a list of all those types of trap cropping that we're going to go over. So the first one is conventional trap cropping. So this is a traditional and proven effective plant where, a traditional and proven effective plant is planted around or within a cash crop that is more attractive to a target pest as either a food source or for reproduction. So the example we have is when there's high populations of stink bugs that can cause excessive feeding damage on our tomato fruits. So a lot of you tomato growers might have noticed different types of stink bugs on your tomato plants this season. So research studies from Pennsylvania State University and the University of Florida have found that sunflowers are an effective in attracting stink bug species away from our solanaceous crops like our tomatoes shown here. So again, this is an example of conventional trap cropping. And this specific setup is actually kind of a study we did a couple years ago at Utah State University, and we found that it's pretty effective as well. So the next one is called dead end trap cropping. So plants that are attractive to a target pest, but on which offspring will not survive. So dead end trap crops serve as a sink and prevent movement of the target pest to a cash crop later in the season. So dead end trap crops are planted in field borders or edges where they can intercept insect pests. So an example is the diamondback moth, which you guys might be familiar with. They're very damaging on our cruciferous crops, so like our broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, kale. A 2005 research study from Cornell University in New York found that the mustard plant, yellow rocket, works well as a dead end trap crop. It's attracted to the adult moths, but when they lay their eggs on it, the larva will or once the larvae hatch, they don't survive because of the glucosinate content in this mustard plant is super harmful and it'll kill it off. So again, this is an example of dead end trap cropping. So the next one is genetically engineered trap cropping. So plants may be genetically engineered to act as a trap crop. Prevention of insect vector diseases is one example where the trap crop is capable of harboring a certain virus, but its insect vector cannot acquire it from that plant. So in this example, the trap crop helps reduce the insect vectored pathogens as opposed to the insect itself. So the example I listed here focuses on the Colorado potato beetle. So we usually don't see a whole lot of these in Utah, but both the adult and the larva are foliage feeders on potatoes, and they can be really destructive if they have high populations. But there have been some potatoes that have been genetically engineered to express proteins from Bacillus thuringiensis, BT, which you guys might be familiar with that bacteria. And that has been used as a trap crop to manage Colorado potato beetle populations. If BT potatoes are planted early in the season to attract the immigrating Colorado potato beetle, they can act as an early season dead end trap crop and prevent the colonization of the interior of the field that is planted to non-BT potatoes. So the next one is kind of a common one that you guys might think of, and that's perimeter trap cropping. So obviously this is trap crops that are planted around the border of the main crop. So one cool example I found focuses on the pepper maggot. So that's a fly that the maggot stage of that fly kind of burrows into our peppers and just makes them super nasty and unmarketable. So the University of Connecticut did some research studying the pepper maggot control in bell peppers by using a trap crop of hot cherry peppers on the perimeter. So the pepper maggots were controlled exclusively on the hot peppers. So this is a good option if you don't want to spray the crops that you're directly eating. So what they did was they only sprayed our trap crops because they weren't planning on eating these anyway. So that's how they controlled the pepper maggots, because they were more attracted to these peppers instead of the bell peppers. So the next one's a little more complicated. This is sequential trap cropping. So trap crops that are planted either later or earlier than the main crop to increase the attractiveness to insect pests during certain times of the season. So in 2014, there were some field studies from Montana State University that showed that the dusky wireworm shown here could be managed in strawberry fields by planting wheat as a trap crop 1 to a couple weeks before the strawberries were planted. So the wheat was already present in the field, and that was more attractive to these wireworm adult beetles. And therefore, they left the strawberries alone in this specific example. So the next one is using multiple trap crops. So planting several trap crop species to manage several pests or controlling a target pest by combining plants whose growth stages enhance attractiveness all season long. So the example I found focuses on these pollen beetles, which were being problematic on cauliflower. So for their multiple trap cropping system, they used, or this happened in Finland at a university there. They used a mixture of Chinese cabbage, marigolds, and sunflowers. And those were successful in attracting the pollen beetle away from the cauliflower, which was the main crop. So another one that's kind of complicated is this push-pull trap cropping idea. So this is a combination system where a trap crop is planted around the perimeter of a crop to attract the target insect pest or pull it. And then a different plant is intercrop to repel or push the insect away from the cash crop. So there was only one kind of example I found that was really studied, and this was actually in Africa, where the corn stem borer was causing a lot of damage on their corn production. So the push-pull strategy used Sudan grass as the trap crop planted around the main crop, and then molasses grass was at the edge of the field as a repellent intercrop. So this greatly increased the important biotic constraint for the stem borers. So the next one is biological control assisted trap cropping. So these are trap crops that are planted within and around the crop that enhance populations of natural enemies that then help suppress multiple pests. So an example is a university in India found that using sorghum as a trap crop worked well to manage the cotton bollworm, which is pictured right here. So what they did was they did the sorghum on the edge, and then the adult moths would lay their eggs, and then the larvae would hatch on the sorghum. But the sorghum was also attractive to this parasitic fly, and that would cause a lot of parasitism on the bollworm going on in the sorghum. So all this was happening on the sorghum, and then the cotton was left free and without pests. So the last example of trap cropping I want to talk about is semiochemical assisted trap cropping. So this is the use of either manually hanging insect semiochemicals, such as pheromone lures, on a perimeter planting, or using genetically modified plants that emit semiochemical lures to attract the target pest. So this example was from Hawaii. They used pheromone-baited fly traps hung around on papaya trees in the papaya orchard, the perimeter ones. And that acted as a trap crop, because then all the flies would get attracted to those specific trees. So then that way they could focus their management on the flies on those specific trees, and then the rest of the papayas they didn't have to worry about as much. So that was a lot of examples, but I think the big question you guys are probably asking yourselves is, will intercropping actually work at my site? Well, I think there's 3 things that you want to consider for your guys' property. First, you want to determine if the pest you're trying to control is actually present. Is your area have suitable climate and suitable host crops for that pest? So you want to pick a pest that you've seen for sure and you know you have a consistent problem with. So if the pest is there, then it's worth trying to manage it. But if the pest isn't there, or if it's just a pest that you're afraid might show up, there's a good chance that the trap cropping, intercropping may not necessarily work. The second thing you guys want to consider is determine what specific cash crop or desirable crop are you trying to protect, and then being familiar with the problems associated with it. So if you have tomato plants that you have a lot of problems, first you want to determine what those problems are and decide if those are actually caused by an insect pest, an arthropod pest, or rather they might be caused by a disease or other abiotic problem. And then, of course, you want to ensure that the timing of your trap crop's growth will attract the damaging life stage of the pest you're trying to control. So if your pest is a problem in the fall, it wouldn't make sense to do your companion planting in the springtime. or if the pest is a big problem early on in the season and you're slow to getting your companion plant out, then that timing's not going to line up and you won't have success trying to manage that pest. So now we're kind of going to switch gears and we're going to look at companion planting. So similar to trap cropping, right? Remember we talked about those definitions. Companion planting can help your garden thrive and be beneficial to plants. It can help deter harmful pests, provide support for crop, improve soil quality, offer shade to smaller plants, provide weed suppression, and attract beneficial insects to your garden. The scents and bright colors of herbs and flowers can confuse harmful pests and attract like those beneficial insects and pollinators that we talked about. So companion planting is a really cool concept that we can incorporate in our garden. So one example that a lot of you guys might have heard about, it kind of derives from a lot of Native American cultures, is the use of this Three Sisters technique. So it's one of the most popular companion plantings, and it involves corn, beans, and squash. So the idea is that the taller plants, such as corn, can provide a natural support or trellis and shelter the beans and other climbing crops. And then in return, the beans provide nitrogen to the soil for the corn and the squash plants. And then the squash plant foliage kind of provides shade to the plant and kind of some sort of weed suppression. So this is kind of an image I found of that Three Sisters technique. One important thing to note though with this technique is most of the nitrogen converted by the beans, it won't actually be available to the corn or the pumpkins that first year. So the bean roots actually have to break down to release the nitrogen, and then corn is a really heavy nitrogen feeder. So side dressing with fertilizer might be necessary that first season, or you can use manure, compost, or some other synthetic fertilizer if you want to establish kind of this Three Sisters technique in your own garden. Another companion planting strategy you guys might have heard is the use of marigolds. So a lot of plants can emit odors that either repel insects, attract them, or simply mask the odor of other plants. So due to these traits, you can use plants to pull pests away from your other crops. So they're kind of like a trap crop like we talked about. And then obviously marigold is the one that we're most familiar with. So marigolds, again, are used as a companion planting, but do they always work? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Again, it just goes back to those factors we talked about earlier. So another companion planting strategy is mixing our cool and warm season vegetable crops. So the idea is you can interplant smaller cool season plants like our spinach, beets, lettuce, in between larger and slower growing vegetables like our tomatoes or peppers. And then once the smaller crops are mature, these larger plants will offer some shade. So here's an example I found where they're growing tomato plants next to their lettuce. Another familiar one that I hear a lot about that people like to do is the mixing of tomatoes and different herbs. So tomato plants can benefit from herbs such as parsley and basil being planted nearby. Parsley draws insects away from the tomato plants, and then basil grown about 10 or so inches from the tomato plants can possibly increase the yields of tomato crops. So with all this said, there's one thing I want you guys to remember. Companion planting is not an exact science. Success of companion planting can differ based off locations and methods. So I know I get a lot of questions, and then we often we read and hear a lot of information about intercropping methods from various mommy bloggers, gardening influencers on YouTube, or you might get a lot of unsolicited advice from Facebook groups. But I personally believe the best method of determining a successful intercropping method would be to try it out for your guys' self. So use the scientific method. This is what you need to do. First, you want to determine the crops you want to use and what pest you're trying to deter. So remember those things. You want to be familiar with that. Second, I think it would be good to plant a control group that's not intercropped with a variable group that is intercropped. And then throughout the season, you can record the effectiveness of that intercropping method in both your control and variable groups. So this can be done by counting the number of pests you find, measuring the yield weights at the end of the season, or just simply conducting visual inspections of your overall plant health. So collect your own data and then kind of be your own scientist and your own judge about these certain intercropping methods and whether or not they work for you at your site. So that kind of concludes about companion planting. And I do want to share kind of some more intercropping examples. And these are ones that are used more in the green industry or the nursery industry, kind of in a large greenhouse setting. And this is the use of banker plants. So banker plants help establish and sustain certain biological control agents, essentially acting as kind of an open rearing system. They provide alternate food or prey, reducing the need for repeated introductions. And then using banker plants often requires diligent scouting for both the beneficial and pest insects. And then the banker plants should never be sprayed with an insecticide, and plants will need to be maintained and replaced when needed. So banker plants are not successful in outdoor situations. So these are examples I'm going to talk about are used exclusively, again, in the green industry or inside large nursery greenhouses. So the first one I found out that was really cool was the use of ornamental peppers to harbor the minute pirate bug. So if you watched any of our presentations before, you know we love the minute pirate bug. They are a great natural predator. So essentially, minute pirate bugs are released primarily for the control of thrips, but they can also feed on spider mites and aphids occasionally. So the downside is that the minute pirate bugs, they are expensive to purchase, but because the adults also feed on pollen, providing flowers can help them build a reproducing population inside your greenhouse. Research has shown that ornamental peppers, particularly the black pearl and purple flash varieties, are highly attractive to both the minute pirate bugs and thrips. The black pearl variety is kind of the industry standard, but some studies have found that the purple flash yields higher populations of nymphs and adults due to the cultivar, egg-laying suitability, and development and survival of the nymphs. And then again, that purple flash variety is more compact and produces more flowers. And then the other example I want to share is the use of cereal plants to harbor aphid parasitoids. So research has shown that barley is the most effective host as a banker plant. So a rotating supply of aphid-infested plants is required for the crop's growing cycle. So to generate the bankers, grow and start the production with the starter plants that are available to purchase. And then the banker plants are moved into the greenhouse on a schedule with 2 introduced into the greenhouse at the first week, and then 1 or 2 in continuing weeks. And then the plants are usually effective for about 10 or so weeks. So again, this is just kind of a really specific example, but it's kind of cool how they're able to provide a safe haven for these beneficials to take on different pest insects. So this video is going to be recorded and it will be available for you guys to look back on and watch, but we do have some other resources on companion planting, trap cropping, and intercropping that you guys can check out. We have a companion planting video from pbsutah.org. where one of our USU Extension faculty in Salt Lake County talks about some examples they've used down there. We have some other videos. And then a good piece of literature that I referenced for this presentation is the concepts and applications of trap cropping and pest management. And this is a paper from Pennsylvania State University. The Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation is another great website, especially if you're interested in learning about what specific plants are shown to attract specific beneficial insects. And then, of course, the USDA's Western SARE program website has a lot of good resources as well. So here's my contact if you guys have any questions about companion planting, trap cropping, intercropping.